Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. I hope you all enjoyed lunch. The second part of our forum will begin with a short recap, or let's say a translation into Estonian context of the previous debate we had with Olli and Heather. And I'm pleased to give the floor to Tarmo Jüristo, head of Praxis Center for Policy Studies. Go ahead, Tarmo.
Thank you. There doesn't seem to be actually good reason to be standing here, but anyway. So I was hoping to start by thanking Olli and Heather for their insightful and interesting, lively opening remarks and debate, but unfortunately they're not in the room with us, so I've been told Heather is going to come back. But starting from this point, I made lots of remarks, lots of topics to cover, but since the time is limited, so I'm just trying to touch a few of them in my opening remarks for the second part of the discussion debate. So first of all, I think Heather made a really important and pertinent point about the sort of the topic of our day, which was a long shadow of the financial crisis, which kind of implies quite directly that many of the problems we are going through in our political lives somehow have stemmed from the financial crisis, from the economic crisis, and I can say from my daily work at the think tank that I also must conclude that the numbers don't quite add up on that front, so they don't tell the same story. Like Heather was saying before, we can find lots of countries where there are really very low unemployment figures. Estonia is one of those, but who have not been spared from the populist movements. At the same time, we can find places where things do not look quite as rosy at all, but which are in a much better shape politically. So in that regard, it seems that something is amiss. On that front, I think there are a few comments to be made. So first of all, it is true that we have been living through a number of years of prolonged growth, and good times are with us, as it's often been put. And for instance, now, according to the latest figures, the European E28 countries' unemployment rate stands at the latest figures. It stands at 7.3%. So this is indeed the lowest figure in almost a decade. However, if you delve deeper into this number, then you can find a lot of countries like Czech Republic, like Estonia as well, where the unemployment is really low. At the same time, it is still in double digits in a number of European countries. It's above 21% in Greece. It's almost 14% in Spain. Digging even deeper into this, so once we start looking, and this is again something that Heather already mentioned, once we start looking into youth unemployment, then the numbers can get really grim. So in Greece, the youth unemployment stands at 43%. It's down from what it was a year ago, but it's still really high. The same thing in Spain, it's 36%. In Italy, it's 31%. There are all sorts of different gaps within these supposedly great economic numbers when we look at them in the European or on the country context. There's an investment gap between North and South Europe. And this is something which is also true at the local level. So in my own job in the think tank, we have been looking very closely at the inequalities in our own country, in Estonia. And just to bring you one example is that one sort of really interesting and important indicator of the health system in a country is, the general one is life expectancy, but the other one, which is sort of overlooked often, is the expected healthily lived years. So how many years can a person expect to live in good health? And this is something where Estonia has made quite a bit of progress over last years. But if you look deeper into the figures, then I'm talking about now men. Estonian men, the highest expectation for healthily lived years is in western part of Estonia, where it stands at 62.2 years. Now, if you zoom in to South Estonia, into Võru County, then the same number, or the same figure, is 42.2 years. So it's 20 years of difference across in the single country and across the distance, which is pretty much exactly 250 kilometers as the bird flies. So it's full generation of difference. And you wouldn't know it if you look at the aggregate numbers, at the average numbers. So this is, I think, a very important point to keep in mind, that when we look at the statistics, when we look at the figures and numbers, then they tell you the story of, I don't want to say they tell the story of the past, but they tell you the story in terms of the past system. However, politically, we are, as both Olli and Heather were insinuating quite a few times, we are in uncharted waters. So in that regard, we need to be more careful with backing up our story with numbers. So we need to look deeper into this. Then one of the other thing that I'd like to bring up here is that when we talk about populist movements propping up in different countries, and we tend to look at this as something that is a necessarily isolationist, necessarily national of a national character. So there are Greek populists, there are Austrian populists, Finnish populists, Estonian populists, and they all sort of seem to be trying to pry the existing system apart. One thing that nags me about this narrative is that at the same time there is ongoing effort of building, if you wish, a new populist international. So these different populist movements in different countries are not just isolated small pieces. They are trying to also form a new sort of international coalitions. This is one thing that in Estonia most people would definitely certainly recognize the name of Ruben Kaalep, who has been arguing for intermarium, so these sort of the countries uniting from the Baltic Sea to the Mediterranean and forming a new populist international. Steve Bannon is touring Europe and trying to form a coalition of right-wing populist movements. So this is something where I think it again deserves to pay close attention to this dynamic as well. So it's not an isolated things happening in different countries. It is a new sorts of coalitions and unions forming at the same time. And this is what gives context for country-based approaches like when we will be discussing Estonia. And then the final thing that I'd like to draw attention to, and this again has an Estonian implication. What it seems to me that we are, or let me backtrack for a moment. So bringing examples from history is something which I find immensely useful of putting into perspective our current predicament. So when we are in a position, we say that we feel that we have no guidance. This is something where we don't know how to go forward. Then for me, it's always helpful to look back into the times of social and economic disturbance at different times and see how these things panned out or played out at that time and see if we can learn something from it. And now, just to bring a quick example of the French Revolution, which was for a long period of time seen as a cataclysmic political event that had a social impact. It is only in the last couple of decades that historians have actually been arguing and proposing that it should instead be viewed as a long, almost century-long period of social change that finally had, in 1789, a political consequence. And this is something which I find personally sort of a useful perspective to look into where we are right now. So it's not just a cataclysm happening and suddenly everything becoming new. It is a long period of social transformation. How long we can talk about that, but which is beginning to have a serious political consequence. And now the question becomes here that we are trying to fix this thing with, trying to put Humpty Dumpty back together again, trying to see ways how the mainstream big political parties, as they emerged in Europe in 50s and 60s, could regain the position they were in. In my opinion, this is a hopeless cause, so this is not going to happen. And already now we can see these big political parties also transforming internally. I had a recently very interesting discussion with a leading figure of a major Estonian party who told me that although they do have a clear political perceived orientation, they contain the whole political spectrum inside of their ranks. So there's no reason to go and vote for EKRE. So you can vote for a, I can't say the names now, but you can vote for the conservative guy in our ranks. We are a liberal party, but we do have a Eurosceptic in our ranks. We have feminist wing in our ranks. We have conservative, liberals, everyone. So you don't need to go anywhere. Whatever your creed or whatever your political views, you can stick with us. We can accommodate all of us. And this, in my opinion, is a very interesting thing, which is not true. It's not only Estonia, in Estonia where this is happening. The political parties that were much more clearly ideologically oriented are also becoming, they contain lots of different political options within their ranks. And I think this is an interesting dynamic to look at both internationally and also in Estonia. But in order not to abuse the time given to me, this is where I would draw the line from my side. So that was what I was taking away from the discussion. And let's see where we end up from here. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I ask the rest of the panel on stage, actually, and Tarmo, you're free to choose a chair for yourself. As you were the first one on stage. So, ladies also, please. So, the discussion you had with an anonymous party chief who happened to be a liberal, as you mentioned, is intriguing, because I also had a discussion at a TV show about 2 weeks ago with a Minister of Interior who, by political affiliation, is a social democrat, or, well, should be one. And when the conversation reached to a point where I asked whether Viktor Orban was defending European values, as he likes to call it, with his famous fence, the Minister of Interior, a social democrat, said yes. He was defending Europe and European values with the fence blocking refugees and migrants. In a way, I can't really imagine a social democrat saying that before 2015, and it still sounded pretty awkward when Minister Anvelt said that. But is that a sign of populism spreading in Estonia, or is that just a natural environment where parties take different views and absorb them, even though if they're social democrats, they can be right-wing populists at the same time? That's, of course, an interesting idea to debate on. And we have Tarmo Jüristo in the panel, who already gave us his initial thoughts. We have Margit Sutrop, Professor of Practical Philosophy and the founding director of the Interdisciplinary Center for Ethics at the University of Tartu. We have Mari-Liis Jakobson, political scientist and associate professor at Tallinn University, and Andreas, Kaju, strategic consultant and partner at Meta Advisory Group. Thanks for all of you. So let's start off. I mean, is there a specific lesson, or let's say a few lessons, that our politicians, I don't want to use the word liberal elites again, as this is a bit controversial, but as let's say the politicians in government should learn from Poland and Hungary, not to step in that direction? Who would like to start? Mari-Liis, you've been looking into populism. What do you think? Is there a lesson to be learned from Hungary and Poland?
A lesson for whom? Could you specify?
To the politicians, so that this does not repeat in Estonia.
Okay, from that aspect. Well, it is kind of different to say. Today we've received I think, a very good introduction into what is considered to be populism in political science. And what I would add to maybe what Heather so brilliantly proposed in the previous panel is that populism is very often also, she brought this parallel of it being a disease, right? Or some kind of like bacteria which can cause different illnesses. It is, I think, a warning sign in many contexts. And the sooner the kind of mainstream parties understand that maybe they are overlooking the sort of the interests or the fears more often of important segments of the voters, the better. So I think this is what the politicians in so-called mainstream parties could learn from those countries.
Go ahead.
Just the way how you put the question, I would imagine that there must be quite a few politicians in Estonia who would have nothing against, same things happening here as it has been in Hungary and Poland.
But
So
a
it
few
really
parties, who would not like to see that kind of a future. Margit, is there something you would recommend?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I also referred to Heather's lecture, actually saying also that populism, in her understanding, is a certain mindset. And I would even add to that, it's a closed mindset, actually. It is playing with oppositions, it is playing with actually watching who are the enemies, internal enemies and external enemies. It is a certain kind of manipulation with people, but also playing down the human rights, actually against the democratic values, and stigmatizing the so-called enemies. And I think this is, from the ethical point of view, always very problematic. When we stigmatize people, we stigmatize certain minorities, certain groups, and when we are actually undermining democracy in this sense. But I think also the learning exercise could be a little bit wider, because it's not only one certain group or certain party getting the majority of votes or influencing the state in these terms, but it's also the learning exercise, I think, in terms of, actually it has been also said that populism is anti-pluralism. And in these terms, just I think it is also getting some kind of echo in Estonian society, where I think what I feel a big threat is not only one party being really radically populist and in terms of representing the closed mindset, but in the whole society, actually the understanding that politics is something awful. Just labeling all the politicians as self-interested people who actually want only to get some kind of privileges or to have their own interests to be realized. And I think when people do not understand, as Heather was also saying, that politics is about actually policies. We need actually politics in order to make some kind of decisions in terms of healthcare, in defense, in education, in all kind of matters. And the way how we actually in a democratic state carry out these policies, we need certain parties. And what is this kind of pluralism is actually healthy, because we can end up with having a communist past, having just one party. And I think some people actually would like to have one party, a strong man's views carried out, or just to have only black and white, only perhaps two arguing. And I think pluralism is something that is healthy, and we need this kind of pluralism in order to have a healthy society and flourishing life. And I think this is something that I also think about citizen movements or non-governmental organizations having a big role, actually, and also education. all the educational institutions should take the responsibility to make people understand why we have the parliament. Because in the end, when we are undermining and all the new parties actually coming and we are against the establishment, we are now promising a better future because we are against the parties and we will do it differently. Then they fail. There will be no party after next election, and in the end, it actually undermines our trust in democracy. I think this is as awful as having just one party getting the majority of the votes with the populist slogans. I think it could be even that it is more awful, because in the end, we do not believe in democracy, but we do not have anything better than democracy, although it has some kind of mistakes, as it was said in the morning session.
Andreas, could rule of law be threatened in Estonia in a way that we see threatened in Poland and Hungary, or do we have a stronger safety net that actually prevents politicians from embarking on this path?
It's hard to say. I mean, we see in several countries where actually even in the US, I think this is manifested most clearly right now, and you could argue that it's actually the constitutional establishment which is actually aggressively and actively pushing back on the administration's attempt to go further than it is allowed or what is acceptable in the US society. And I suppose, and I've thought about it a little bit without having a clear answer, that if I'm not particularly scared of or afraid of having populism as part of your political spectre, especially in a multi-party system where the normal amount of political parties, if you take Taagepera's formulas as a baseline, then is 6 to 7 parties anyway. Having a populist party there is, it's fine, and it probably, I think, gives voice to legitimate concerns which the pluralist political system is not able to. And especially while I agree, of course, that we need pluralism, then I think one of the reasons why we have these issues right now with these populist parties is that arguably there is no pluralism. That while you might have any number of parties on the political spectre, they populate the political middle ground. They are, technocratic. Politics has been de-ideologized, whether it's, monetary or fiscal policy. It's all become this technocratic mumbo jumbo, and there are no ideological arguments there. And I think the same applies to a lot of the issues that address our private lives, that are sort of addressed by sort of technocratic or constitutional arguments and viewpoints without any moral philosophy or ideology in there. So I think one of the ways to view populism is that it's a reaction to a non-pluralistic system. The fact that there are a number of parties there doesn't make it definitely pluralistic. But again, going back to your question and trying to answer it in Estonia, it is an interesting question. I'm looking at, for example, Estonian Defense Police Board, thinking about them most actively. And having said that, I'm not afraid of having a populist party part of the political spectre, but were they to be in power, including having a couple of the key portfolios in law enforcement, and were they to try to do something, would there be pushback from our sort of constitutional establishment institutions who are there to protect the constitutional order? I think I'm a constitutional Republican, so to speak, and I believe that is the last line of defense. It's the Constitution and those who should be protecting it. And I think, of course, it's super dangerous to bring like the Defense Police Board up on this stage and start having this discussion with them. What do you feel about these guys? Are you going to step in if these guys are going to do something? And I'm not sure if they have the answer or what that answer would be, because of course they protect the Constitution, but they are also in some particular way an ideological organization which is tilted towards a certain view of the world. Not in a bad way, but it is, who they are from the point of view of their identity.
Tarmo.
But I would just like to frame the issue in the terms like the question was posed. So the question was, let's just be clear what's at stake, as it was implied in the question. If we refer to Hungary, Poland, Turkey, a few other examples like this, then this is not a question of having a populist party in the parliament. It is having a populist party in the position of power where they can actually go and quite legally change these tenets of constitution that you hope would keep the wolves at bay. And that's, I think, the pressing issue that needs an answer. I don't have any anxiety over having a populist party in the parliament. Even if I did in the past, I mean, I've grown used to it now. So this is not the issue. But if indeed the question becomes that someone gains a power of reframing these safeguards, then we're talking about a different problem.
You share the view that we have a technocratic problem in Estonian politics?
That's where I do agree with Andreas that this is not the Estonian thing. It's the way how the politics has been conducted in the Western world, or I should say the Northern Hemisphere, over last quite a few decades.
Right. Nationalism is a big issue these days. You wanted a comment, sorry?
Yes,
I didn't see your hand.
Sorry,
there. Go ahead. I can wait with my question.
Right, sorry. No, I just wanted to actually follow up to what Tarmo said about populists, ruling Estonia or making it into Estonian government. I think actually there is quite a good propensity to do that, because if we think about Estonian political culture in general. Gerd Hofstede, a theorist and an economist who has been writing a lot about corporate culture, has something which is called the sort of power distance index about different countries. And according to this index as well, Estonia has a rather low power distance in comparison to lots of other countries. And I think this also makes Estonians much more sort of accepting of this kind of populist criticism. Now, the worry here, I think, isn't populism. It is that once those powers get into government, they are no longer populist. Rather, they become authoritarian. And I think authoritarianism is actually the danger that sort of the Constitution has to protect us from, and also what we need to look out for when those forces are going to start implementing policies.
Thank you. Now, let's talk about nationalism. It's a big issue, and I think you can already read analysis from, let's say, liberals who claim that some of the parties, especially in Eastern Europe, have overlooked this passion towards nationalism and may have therefore sparked this populist ultra-right-wing movement by doing so. Now, is Estonia in a more vulnerable position to this new, let's say, rather extreme wave of nationalism or populist way of nationalism that we see due to our segregated society? I mean, what are the threats, if there are threats, that you see in this new wave?
Go
ahead, Andreas.
If I can just sort of hit it here first. I mean, in the Estonian case, I think it's part of the sort of baseline of Estonian politics. Is depends on the viewpoint, of course, but a healthy dose of patriotism or an unhealthy dose of patriotism, nationalism, or nativism being the more ill variants of the same thing, more or less. So, I think I don't think that's the main thing or the main issue here, or the main threat. Too much patriotism or too much nationalism. I think it's just one of the ways or one of the things that populism uses right now, given what are the particular issues on the agenda which have given populism such power and dynamism in the last decade. You know, immigration and the refugee issue. And I think this nationalism is a response to that mostly.
Yep.
I think if we think about what the mainstream parties have been doing in terms of nationalism in Estonia, then I think this sort of way of thinking or worldview has been very well represented in Estonian politics. And in fact, in the early 2000s, Andres Kasekamp and Taunis Auers were trying to analyze, like, why doesn't Estonia have this kind of like far-right populists, and why don't we see these kind of extremes in Estonian politics? And what they came up with is that the mainstream parties have so easily absorbed this kind of nationalist sentiment that there is nothing, you know, left over for the radicals anymore. But when we look at the most recent wave of the European Social Survey, this was in 2016, there was also a question which was roughly phrased as, do I feel that immigrants make my country a better place to live? And in general, the majority of Estonians have been, you know, rather answering no to this question. But the naysayers have been decreasing over time. However, in this 2016 wave, we saw like a slight movement upwards. So there, you know, clearly is this kind of sentiment, an anti-immigrant sentiment, not just nationalist sentiment there, which has been, you know, taken advantage of pretty well in the political competition. And, you know, I think the immigration issue is more, you know, at focus here rather than nationalism in general.
So you don't see a threat with becoming too nationalist in Estonia in politics?
What do you mean by becoming too nationalist?
Actually, this is for
sorry.
is for Margit.
I can't see anything.
Yeah, I should change my position. Actually,
I have to turn. Sorry.
come here.
I mean,
Is that okay?
yeah.
Go ahead, Margit.
Yeah, I think just let us go back to the constitution. I mean, our constitution says what the Estonian state is for. It is for protecting the Estonian language, for protecting Estonian culture and the people, and the peoples of Estonia. And I think in these terms, actually, I would be very careful labeling our movements as nationalist movements, because this is exactly what our opponents or enemies want us to become, nationalists who are really in opposition to somebody or having more segregated society. I'm even not very, I mean, I'm not an expert in this field, but just from the citizen's point of view or from the ethicist's point of view, when I think about values, in terms of values, I actually think that we can witness a certain movement of having the Russian-speaking young people at least getting more actually political patriotism, being more actually patriots of the state. There is quite a lot of talk, I think almost like an agreement to have a comprehensive school. We only have very different views what it means actually to have people with different mother tongues studying together, what kind of model we will take. But I think these are all quite positive movements. Of course, there is EKRE, there is this one party who is a populist party, clearly, and they are having this populist in the form where they say, we actually represent the people's will, I mean, and then the people are real Estonians. I mean, this is very similar to Põlissoomlased in Finland or something. They know actually what is good for Estonians. And what they actually, what they are doing is, of course, playing on some kind of threat to Estonian language being in a minority or decreasing population, and I think, of course, the danger is there, and then the people have this sentiment. But the question is actually what comes out of this. What do they make then with this kind of game? And I think this goes in parallel to what's going with the migration crisis in Europe, but it's not exactly which is happening in Estonia. They play on another sentiment. They rather refer to the big population, 1/3 of people being Russian-speaking and being actually some kind of quite unique situation where we have what we have in Estonia and Latvia, I think, quite different from other European countries. So the situation is different. They use the same rhetoric, the populist rhetoric, and they play with this crisis, but the crisis is not there. It's rather that we are afraid of not being sustainable as a culture and being afraid what happens to our language and what is the position of Estonian language. But I wouldn't call it nationalism. It's really, I think we should make the distinction and not label it in the same way as the nationalist movements in other European countries have.
Tarmo, your thoughts on this?
I would like to try and turn a little bit of a corner on this issue, and I've been thinking for the last couple of minutes hard how to make this point concise so that it wouldn't turn into a academic theoretical rambling about the nature of populism. If I try to put it in a clearest and most concise terms, then I think it's important to keep in mind that populism is not something that happens within the well-defined confines of the political system and remains there. It's the force that's structuring this very same political system. And just to bring an example, what I mean by this, and this, then I try to relate it back to the nationalism issue. I don't know how many of you have seen this great sort of piece of data journalism that New York Times did on the 2016 US election, where they took the extremely detailed map of the voting districts of the United States and color-coded them according to whether it went to Clinton or Trump. And it's a great map where you can zoom in, and if you look at that map, then it becomes blatantly clear that most of the map is red, and then you have these blue dots in cities. And this is what has happened. So, in the time of the Civil War in the United States, you had north and south, but now it's divided along different axes. So it's cities versus non-cities. And coming back to this, now that's what I also am afraid of in Estonia with this trying to, the nationalist discourse, and I'm not using it as a derogatory word here, becoming too pronounced in the political discourse. This will tear apart the existing idea of the nation being based on a constitution and the sort of a relationships which people share. Sure. So it will create different kind of political system, and in some ways this can be this is the international nationalist movement, like I was saying, Intermarium, where Visegrad countries say that we have to join together because we have this common shared value of nationalism being the paramount importance, so we have to take it international. So it's not contained within one country. It can change fundamentally the way how the Europe is built up, and this will have implications. So I could think back to the times of Reformation, where you had these islands of Protestant order cropping up in the Catholic Europe, and this didn't end with there being Protestant countries in the Catholic Europe. It ended up with Augsburg peace, Westphalian peace, and it ended up with nation states in the Europe, which was a new world, not the old one sort of reconfigured.
Mm.
The refugee crisis was already mentioned several times. Let's try to be clear. Like, has this new movement on more and more Euroscepticism in the public sphere, was that the refugee crisis that sparked that? Are there other issues in Europe that have been dictating this shift in mood? Mari-Liis?
Well, if you look at the data, then I can't really say that we have a great surge of Euroscepticism. According to the most recent Eurobarometer, there were like 16% of Estonians who felt that Estonia would be better off outside of the EU. So, and this has been in decrease. So I can't really say that we have a problem with Euroscepticism in Estonia. Of course, there is a big and broad issue around how to deal with this kind of a wicked problem of uncontrolled migration across borders, and the fact that there hasn't been like a convenient and functional solution sort of achieved on the EU level in this question. So there was this plan of quotas, which was like one kind of a solution. Now the the Council of the European Union tried to come up with another type of a plan, which is radically different from this. But frankly, you know, it appears that the format of the EU is rather difficult for, you know, solving this kind of problem. But I don't think that these debates on the EU level are very much, you know, shaping the attitude towards the EU. I think in the Eastern European context, this has much more to do with, you know, the check that comes from the EU, and all of those different fields that actually depend on EU funding for living a decent life.
Andreas?
Yes, but I think that the common man really doesn't think about wealth transfers or the subsidies that much. And I think the same Eurobarometer that you referred to, which does show that Estonia is in the company of the small liberal nations of EU, Sweden, the Dutch, but also Lithuania and Latvia to a lesser extent, who has an extremely high favorability rating still towards the European Union, even today in 2018. But if we look at what are the pillars to that favorability rating, Estonians again stand out with the same nations, where there's one major overarching pillar for that support, which is the free movement of people. 75% of Estonians feel that this is the most important thing, and the other reasons come way, way behind. The second one is far less than 50%, and the third and fourth and fifth reasons even much lower than that. And I think that's where the danger of the sort of the political repercussions of the refugee crisis lie. And if the reaction were to be very violent in that fence building in the end of our temporary some temporary restrictions to Schengen or something else, then that's where I think the support of those small liberal nations such as Estonia towards the EU might start eroding as well. And this is why I think I don't see the refugee issue with much life anymore in it in Estonian politics or in this region of the world in a specific sense. But in general, if this were to bring about a fence building project in the EU or something akin to that, then that would definitely be a politically a dangerous thing strategically.
Tarmo?
I think Estonian voters, many of them don't necessarily realize that the fences go both ways. So, but what I want you to mention with this is that I remember the sort of first real surge of sort of the kicking or resistance to the European Union being related to the financial crisis and Greek crisis in specific, where the issue actually ended up being debated and decided in the Supreme Court, where it passed, the European Stability Mechanism passed by the narrowest of margins, with just one vote, where the issue was indeed whether this is a sort of a limiting infringement of the national sovereignty.
The Greek program has ended.
Well, but coming back, when your question was initially where was the refugee crisis that sparked it, then I would say no. It started already before with the financial crisis, and that's where the shadow of financial crisis might be pertinent.
Yeah. Margit?
Again, in terms of value, this Greek crisis is quite interesting, that the Finns were actually very much against paying the debts of the Greek because they were not honest, whereas Estonians were saying they were not working hard. I mean, the work ethics is something that the Estonians value most, so everybody should actually do something in order to achieve the happiness that is promised as in the end. But just also referring to the Eurobarometer, I think when I agree very much with Mari-Liis that actually it doesn't show that we are our Euroscepticism is big, it is quite low, and I think it is also related to, there is a strong correlation between the trust to the government and governmental institutions and actually then also the life satisfaction and then what we think about Europe. In terms of free movement, I think when our people are quite happy with the life standard or with the economic situation, it's, I think, strongly related to the borders being open. When we don't get the salary here, we just move somewhere where the salary is paid, and we see actually there is a lot of this kind of free movement going on. So in this sense, I think people just solve the problem, and it's not perhaps having. It's not good every time for our state, but it solves the question with the life satisfaction. Where the refugee crisis, I think, should be viewed here also in relation to the threat of terrorism. I think for many people, actually, they put these things together. It's not very justified to put these things always together, but I mean, this is what just common people do. It's very common that people think, okay, the people are coming and they are threatening us and they are against the peace, and this is in terms of security a problem. And as I said before, the other aspect is actually a threat to when there will be more people who are not speaking our language, whether our language will be sustainable, are we able to use Estonian language, will we be in the minority in the end? But this is not very justified when we look at the numbers, how many people come and how many people stay here in terms of refugee crisis, I mean.
Well, the elections are approaching fast. I think the politicians are trying to come up with those new narratives. I mean, we all know the legendary narrative of Estonia becoming one of the 5 most wealthiest countries in Europe. I think everyone has understood that this isn't happening soon, but maybe, I mean, as I have an excellent panel on stage and perhaps some politicians are watching the live feed, maybe you can give out some ideas. I mean, what could the narrative, the next big narrative Estonia is missing right now, what could it be? Who has bold ideas?
Well, Andreas is a professional.
Andreas probably has designed a few.
I think you are essentially, addressing the right issue, because what the populists have done is that they have not only created a narrative, but they have carved out a social group, given them a new joint shared identity, given them a cause. The people see that what is being talked about is about the experiences that they have had in their lives. At least this is how they feel. They don't, because of that, particularly assess whether the individuals that have taken up their cause are competent or not. That's besides the point. That there's finally, at last, somebody who is standing up for the little man, for the common man.
The populists have managed to do that. What about the mainstream parties?
Exactly. I mean, why they've been able to do that is that there is no such approach anymore from the mainstream pluralism from the political parties. As Tarmo pointed out in his opening remarks, that the political party which he so very well hid behind the curtain and nobody understood, which he is talking about, is exactly, it's our archetypical political party, the People's Party of today, who thinks that we represent the whole spectre of different views, and through this political alchemy machine, we distill this into this broad patriot Estonian vision of how the country should be going forward. But you know, the different groups no longer identify or don't see themselves. And I think without giving a solution, because I don't have any, and I'm, you know, this is beyond me at this point at least. But I think the way back, and I can see that at least slowly happening, I think, from the Social Democrats. They have tinkered most, I think, in the last years because of their basic constant crisis inside. They have tinkered most with, you know, with their ideology, what they are and where they should be going through, and what is the group that they should represent. And I think they, for example, in 2015, new leader in June in his speech said that we're going to fight for open society and liberal values. Now, in his speech in late 2017 and first speech in 2018, he basically put that aside and is reorienting the party towards the working class. But I think he's actually doing that but I think he has some other problems. But let's see. Yeah, I think what they're doing is exactly that kind of an answer. What I would like to see from all the political parties to populism is that, again, becoming more ideological, thinking through again their cause, who are they fighting for and why, and letting go. And I think it's hardest, let's say it out, for the Reform Party to do that, because they've been in power for so long, and they think that the formula that they have still works. Let's see, you know. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But for them, it's hardest probably to make it ideological again, their cause.
Margit, any ideas for the party chiefs?
Just in terms of narratives, I would like to see, and this is my wish, that all the parties actually will try to make it true that we are one of the most educated people in Europe or in the world. Just PISA tourism already starts, knowing that we are on the top of the PISA studies. I mean, we will have a conference in October where the headmasters of schools from Europe come here to learn actually what we have done in our education. But I am just preparing a new lifelong learning strategy. 3 groups have started their work, and I am leading the group in terms of values and responsibility. We had a big discussion yesterday in Tartu, and we know there are problems. So it's not so ideal as it looks like, but we have already something in hands, and we are already known as doing well in terms of education, but a lot more needs to be done. And just a little story. I went to Oxford in 1991, and my professor sitting in one college, in Balliol College, was asking actually, Margit, are Estonians learned people? And I was not really, it was not in my vocabulary. I didn't understand what it means to be learned people. And he explained, are Estonians just like how many, do they read newspapers? Do they go to the theater? Actually, do they have books at home? And I said, yes, we do. I mean, the ordinary family is just ordering 2 or 3 dailies, and they all go 2 times in theater, and they want their kids to get a better education. So I think we are learned people. We still are, even if our novels are not printed in 35,000 copies as it was at that time in 1991 when I went to Oxford. But I think we all actually worry, and we all are concerned that and we are ready that our children get better education than we got. We value education, and now we have to put it in practice so that we also, in terms of expenditure, put more money in education, in research, make really knowledge-based economy and politics true, so that our decisions are also helping to get innovation, more innovation and more high-tech solutions, and the flourishing economy, and also people living a better life, because we know that the more educated people actually have a more flourishing life. They are more happy, they are more healthy, they have more social contacts. So I think I would very much like that whatever kind of party is thinking about this big narrative will also think how education make us flourish and live a better life, and be also even in terms of all kind of ratings, actually on the top of the list.
Well, the Estonian budget in a way is similar with the MFF, where everyone talks about innovation and science, but eventually no money is put into the budget.
Sure, but it is even worse because OECD, the study shows that actually the expenditure on education is getting down. I mean, of course, we put actually in terms of money, we may put the same, but it's the percentage of the GDP is actually going down, and this is a catastrophe. We can't say that we can survive as a nation with all the aims that we are having if we don't put money in education and research.
Tarmo, your ideas for the moderates?
Well, first of all, I must say I don't have an answer, like Andreas was saying, but to relate with something that Andreas mentioned, it appears to me, it seems to me that this problem of dispersion, ideological dispersion within the mainstream parties is not something that in Estonia is related to only one party, definitely not the one you mentioned, and also outside of the Estonia, in Europe, you can see the same thing. If you become a real sort of mainstream party, in Estonia, that would mean that yes, you would be, looking at something more than 20-25% of votes. Then it is impossible, in my mind, to stick with this. Speaking to your potential voters through one ideological line. It is possible to do that when you're working for a negative identification, saying what you're not. Then you can build a broader base. But in my mind, this is the point that I was referring to before in my opening remarks. We are living in a different kind of world compared to the 50s and 60s, when it was possible to apply for sort of a class-based broad identification like Labour did in UK. Now the people's positive identification is much more fragmented, and that's true everywhere. And this is something like, for instance, EKRE, the Estonian sort of right-wing conservative, I don't know if it's right-wing, well, the sort of the populist conservative party is struggling with their revolving door of candidates who come in and say that, I'm a conservative, I have a conservative agenda, and that, oops, this also means the gay rights, so sorry, I'm leaving. So these problems are already cropping up there as well, that as long as you say that you're conservative in terms of not being liberal, then it's relatively easy. But once you start to take that apart and say that what does it mean to be exactly conservative, then these fault lines appear there as well. And this is what I think this goes back to my point that I was trying to make before in broad terms, that big mainstream political parties are facing really, really uncharted waters, and the political representation does not work the way it used to, and I don't think there's a chance that it will revert to this mode.
Mari-Liis?
Yeah, my consultations usually go by the hour. But
Yeah, well, if they're watching, I mean, they know where to send the fee.
Right. Well, I think what all of the panelists presented is beautiful, and I'd love to go to these kinds of elections as a citizen. Unfortunately, I'm a bit skeptical whether this kind of like ideological self-searching is actually timely anymore for the upcoming elections. I think the Estonian electorate isn't too well, or hasn't self-defined itself too well along the ideological lines. So we have much more of this kind of voter volatility and also reactive voting against a particular type of party. So yeah, I would also say that the Social Democrats and EKRE have been working well with their electorate in terms of introducing their ideology and sort of providing this kind of argumentation to their respective electorates. For the others, it's much more difficult. Concerning other issues, I think actually what Tarmo said is very very telling at the moment. Estonia is very small and yet so big. This kind of regional disparities are a big issue. I think the President of the Republic has also lent public attention to this issue, so it could be a relatively easy and important issue to pick up. Also, the Gini index in Estonia has been growing again. From the data that we have, we don't have it for the most recent years. And on the other side, also these kind of, the state reform, the government reforms are still, a big topic for, those parties who aren't so much into this kind of social cohesion issues and socioeconomic equality and so on. So I think these are going to be big issues for these elections.
Andreas remembered something.
Just tying to a question and then remembering what Tarmo pointed out about the US experience, the charted map, the cities versus the rural voters, urban versus rural. It's, Moretti published a book in 2012 exactly about that issue, and I think it's also adequate in the Estonian case. If we look at the Estonian EKRE or the far right or the populist right, it's nothing new. It's the former Rahvaliit or the People's Union, which is a rural party. So in Estonia also, I think the roots of the supporter base of that movement right now, it's an economic geography issue. It's a spatial issue. These people are mostly in the rural areas, but that of course not only is an Estonian phenomenon, but a sort of a global phenomena that life is dying out in the countryside. It's super hard there. If you're born to a family in the countryside, your outlook is much bleaker, your educational opportunities and so on. So, of course we're discussing this from a technological viewpoint. You're asking what the parties should do about their narratives and so on. But then again, always keeping in mind that it's not only a political issue, it's also a policy issue. How should we help the disenchanted voters where they are and what are their issues? It's the people in the countryside where life is dying out, and it will die out despite the efforts of the previous president who tried to make a case throughout his 2 terms that it will be possible. But no, it won't. There's no theater, cinema, jobs, life, innovation, nothing there, and never will be. It will be nice to stay in the countryside, but life in the 21st and in the 22nd century will not take place in rural areas. So we have to help that transformation somehow, and we're probably not even making an effort right now. Go ahead.
It has been said that from the countryside, people go to Tallinn, and if they don't go to Tallinn, they go to Finland or to Australia or to whatever places. So I think it's not only the movement from rural areas to the cities, but it's also the question actually how many people are leaving the country. I mean, I know the tendency actually at the moment, the stream is positive. I mean, more people are now coming back, but it may be different in terms of generations, or when you look different age groups or in different social groups, who is leaving the country, who is coming back. There is one issue that we know is actually that even coming back, it may not be easy to find a job and to find a place in a kindergarten and to find a flat where, for rent and so on. So I think quite a lot actually can be also done in order to actually keep Estonia big in terms of just having in mind also those people who are living outside and who are coming back and may be able to come back. I think also in terms of education, for example, how many possibilities are there to get Estonian education when you are living with your parents outside Estonia? Because it's very important. I mean, economically, Estonia is going to be to in the future do better. I'm very sure it will. I'm an optimist also. I think because of economic reasons, less people may be leaving. But when they are coming back, young people will only get integrated and will have the possibility to be integrated in the society if they have kept the language. In terms of education, this is very, very important. And also to think of in terms of higher education. I mean, the numbers are quite worrying when we see that quite many people actually are leaving the country and starting to study in 10% less actually continue their education in Estonia. They are leaving the country and going there. Nothing against it. I have got my education abroad. I think it is very important, but it's important they come back. And in terms of just keeping the doors open also for those who have left is something that we have to think about, I think.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are running out of time. I have too many more questions, but you have better questions. You raised your hand first. The microphone will soon find you. Go ahead.
Is it working? I also have some comments very quickly. Most of us had a friend called Pipi in childhood, yes, and Pipi was looking for spunks, so nobody knew what it is, and I have got kind of feeling that we are speaking about populism without formulating what exactly is the populism, and we have very different views on it. And I wrote it down what I see what the populism is. I think populism is a politician, a group of politicians spreading lies in order about spreading lies on political and social issues to gain popularity. And I very much disagree with the tone of this debate, where I kind of feel that the Estonian government is not still populist. I think Estonian government is currently very populist, and you will feel it when you are stuck with the problems. Let me just also tell you that we are speaking about the elections that are coming, and nobody mentioned that this so-called political populist party EKRE is raising up the main question at the elections. I read it, I'm not from EKRE, and this is going to be a need for judicial reform. This government here in Estonia offered me 60,000 euros 3 years ago to cover up the poisoning and euthanasia of my 26-year-old son Oliver. Most of you know this case. And I completely think that this is not populism to have a very, very substantial change in Estonian political system and judges legal system. And one last remark about the Poland and Hungary. I hear this tape going on all the time that because of the immigration, Hungary and Poland are very bad countries. Sorry, but the immigration was created by United Nations, by Western countries. It was a few years before it started. BBC wrote a big article, someone called Sutherland. I worked for United Nations for many years, so I will just tell you that the Sutherland had a big conference on migration. He was the head of United Nations Migration Fund, and he said, we need millions and millions of immigrants in order to keep up the good life level in Europe. And then they started to come. It had nothing to do with compassion. I have said it also before.
Do you have a question, or
no,
was
actually,
that just a statement?
No, I just,
okay.
Yes,
do we have a few questions?
Maybe, Johannes, maybe
yes.
the only question is if someone wants to formulate what is populism, because...
Well, we did define populism in our previous panel quite...
Yes, but I kind of didn't understand it. I think populism is not having correct ideas.
Right. Can we get a question from there? Over there. Okay. The first gentleman over there, and then you, okay? Go ahead.
Hi, I have a concrete question, but it's about the Estonian context, so just a little explanation. A few years ago, we had this movement from the parties to create these foundations of democracy to kind of research and discuss their ideology with the people. And we, and I say we because I was also part of that movement from the NGO side, were against that. And I'm not being original when I'm asking you now, should we have allowed that? Should we have, maybe we should have supported that. And the question now is, maybe we should support it now.
Right.
Maybe parties should have foundations. It doesn't matter what kind of form they are, but work that means understanding their own ideologies, talking about their ideologies with their own electorate, basically, and talking about their ideologies with other people as well.
Right. Can you pass on the microphone on your right-hand side? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Grzegorz Kozłowski, Polish ambassador. Thank you very much for this very interesting discussion. But I was expecting a little bit more about the economic state of affairs in Estonia just before the election. one comment, because on one hand you are saying let's not stigmatize certain groups, minorities, let's not label certain parties, countries, but on the other hand you are doing that. Naming Poland and Hungary constantly, as I wrote it, nationalistic, populistic, ultra-right-wing movements, which has almost nothing to do with true. And I remember my conversation with former Assistant Secretary General of NATO. He was talking to me once time, you know that I like very much reading the newspapers, because I realized that 80% of them I liked it very much. But then I stopped it, because then I realized that I have a knowledge on the other 20%. So please reshape your thinking about what is going on in real terms in Poland. Of course, I can understand that you can refer to Brussels discussion. That's obvious. But two things. First of all, the discussion is going on between Brussels and Warsaw. And if the verdict of the European Court of Justice will be done, then Poland will be accustomed to the verdict. And second, there are more than 50 verdicts of the European Courts of Justices which are not implemented by more than 10 countries, and none of them is dedicated to Poland. So again, please try to reshape your very, I would say, straightforward parallel to Poland and Hungary. Thank you.
Right. Do we have questions from the audience? I'm missing a few questions. Go ahead.
Thank you. Kristi Raek, Director of the Estonian Foreign Policy Institute at ICDS. I have a comment and a question. The comment is that this talk about populism easily gets very confusing because the concept is so confusing, even after having heard all the scientific, political, scientist definitions of it. But I think what Mari-Liis mentioned in the beginning of the debate was something very important, that the real concern should be about authoritarianism. And this is more easy to identify, to measure. There are studies looking at different aspects of decrease of democracy, rise of authoritarianism. And this is something that is there as a global trend. It's something that we see in some European countries. And I'm sorry to say to the Polish ambassador, there are signs of weakening of democracy in Poland. But that was a comment, but then a question is, what, in your view, are the main dividing lines in Estonian politics today and in the forthcoming elections? Because there has been a lot of discussion about how the old right-wing, left-wing division is no longer so relevant. It's being replaced with open versus closed, conservative versus liberal. To some extent, this is something you pointed at, talking about the Social Democrats and EKRE. So is this a dividing line that you think will be more visible in Estonia, or is there something else, or are the parties just going to stay too similar, as you said?
Let's start with those two questions, as we have a big panel to discuss this. So, Andreas.
Yeah, no, I don't think that particular cleavage, open versus closed societies, is working in Estonia. It didn't work in the Swedish elections either. The Swedish moderates and the Social Democrats centered on security being the #1 issue in the Swedish elections. In Sweden, security, #1 issue. Of course, security was just paraphrasing immigration and anti-immigration into a more polite and suitable rhetoric, and they really were talking about immigration through other words and issues. And I think in Estonia too, what the Social Democrats, at least their current leadership, seems to be going through is again pivoting back from the open-closed cleavage to a more classical labor, trade union, work takers and work givers schism cleavage. Now, it remains to be seen whether it's going to work or not, as Tarmo suggested, that going back to those cleavages probably isn't that helpful if you want to be a 25% political party, and you have to be able to attract a broader electorate. But that's a really, really tall order. I think it's much easier to try to identify more specific groups that can see that in what you are saying and posing and defining as the main problems, and proposing as the solutions identify with the life experiences that they are currently having and the social context that they're living in, and their more healthier emotional and rational bond can be formed between the political party and the electorate, which sort of renews the belief that the political system is able to respond to actual things happening in society and clean up behind itself. Because, just as a final point, if we look at global polling, then either the Eurobarometers or whatnot, then we can see that there's a general decline in belief and trust towards institutions over the Western world in the last 25 to 30 years. So it's, there are these trends in the background, completely independent of the refugee issues and so on. And it just reveals, I think, the complexity of life where we are in and the inability of the systems, the large systems, to respond to these complexities and solve these issues for the people. And people are just witnessing that the systems are not able to solve the issues that they have and respond by either distrusting or then going for the madman who wants to just blow up the system, and because whatever comes is going to be better than what we have.
Mm-hmm. Tarmo?
I would perhaps like to address the question that Martin was raising about the TASA, or the party-affiliated think tanks, as it was proposed mostly, I think, by Rait Maruste. And it's an intriguing question, asking that, if that plan had succeeded, would we be living in a better world? So it's a counterfactual claim, we will never know. But I remain skeptical. So this is an idea that is basically taken over from the German system, where you have the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, the Social Democrats have their own think tanks, and this is something that seems to work quite well in Germany. But this is it's a long list of caveats that I could bring, which make Estonia and Germany very different in these respects. And if I look back and say that, try and imagine the world where the parties, the existing political parties, would have had a bit more money of, promoting or selling their own worldview and political ideas, if that would have made a difference, I don't believe so. I don't think that's the main thing. Apart from all these things that were raised at that time, like putting up additional barriers for parties coming outside of the parliamentary system, so on and so forth. I think that this money, there are better ways of spending that money than trying to give it as a sort of marketing expense for political parties.
Mm-hmm.
Margit?
I will also continue on the same issue. I would have liked actually Martin to say why you were at that time against it and now you think this may be a good idea. I mean, it could have been interesting. I don't know if you want to answer this question, but knowing the German system quite well, I also continue on the same lines that actually these Stiftungs, these foundations, they're also doing quite a lot of work in terms of not only promoting their ideas, but also doing a lot of educational work. They are having scholarships, and actually they promote young people also to get better education in these terms, and also in terms of public debates, running the public debates and keeping these political issues also in a more knowledgeable level in the public debate. But I am also skeptical whether this could work in Estonia, because, and this is because of this same issue, that whether our political parties have their real worldviews. Are they parties for actually representing this worldview, or is it something different? What is actually behind it? And just one nice remark that I yesterday heard when we were discussing in Tartu the new youth politics, actually, or youth strategy. And the question was actually, was it the right thing to give our young people the right to vote at the age of 16, actually in local elections? We are forerunners and it's very nice. And then people were saying, oh, but many people, including young people, are very worried that actually they don't have the level of education or the level of knowledge or just making an informed decision. And then somebody saying in the audience, and I think this was quite witty, saying that actually it's very good that the young people they know what they do not know. This doesn't concern all the other electorate. Actually, it's quite good that they know what they don't know. It's very philosophical, isn't it? And I think in these terms, we could say that a lot could be done, not only with young people getting more knowledge, actually, about different ideologies and what the parties are doing and what democracy is, but it concerns much more the grown-ups, actually, who may even not know what kind of knowledge is missing. And who can do it? Is it the parties, or I doubt it's rather our educational institutions, non-governmental organizations who could take the lead and actually raise the level of education about democracy. And this is an urgent need. So it's very nice that you raised this issue, and it should be discussed whose responsibility it is. But at the time being, I wouldn't give this right or this kind of responsibility to our parties. Thank you.
Mari-Liis, would you like to add something?
I can add up. I have to say that to some extent I agree with my fellow panelists on the DASA issue, or party financing, although I can quote my colleagues who wrote already back then that this isn't a bad idea in case we sort of link it with intra-party democracy demands, so that this funding would actually indeed be used for making parties work as democratic organizations, as it is in Germany, where there is actually legislation to organize this kind of internal process as well. Concerning other sort of issues brought up, populism is a tricky word to formulate, and very often, it's used as a political vehicle or a political weapon just to, label everything we don't like. I would say that populism is the type of policy which claims that we are giving power back to the people. So unfortunately, we already have a word for lying, and that's called lying, or giving, promises without fulfilling them. So that's not actually, what's discussed as populism in academic discourse. And I also had a master's student who analyzed Estonian media based on what do people mean when they say populism. And she found, I think, like 7 different discourses. So populism meant like 7 totally different things.
Could be 70.
And this was one of the most popular ways how populism was used, that politicians are giving promises and not fulfilling them. So we can say this is the Estonian popular definition of populism, but this isn't something that is conceptually consistent. So today, I think we were talking about something very different.
So thank you very much for all of you. I believe an applause is necessary, right?
Thank you.